Thank you, Dr. Tsovilis. Let me begin by thanking the Archons for the opportunity for all of us to gather here today to hear Dr. Tsovilis. Thanks to His Eminence, Archbishop Elpidoforos. Thank you to Father Alex Carloutzos, the advisor to the Archons, and thank you to all of you who are gathered here today, and to Costa for that gracious introduction. I'd like to begin by asking you maybe to reflect a little bit, Dr. Tsovilis, on your experience in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. We're all gathered here because we believe in the positive power of religion. We believe that religion can help to prevent violence and also to resolve conflict. And yet, there is a history in Europe of skepticism around the positive potential and impact of religion. Can you tell us if you've seen any change over time in the attitude of your fellow parliamentary members towards religion? And more specifically, for all of us here today, can you tell us about specific institutional mechanisms and modes of engagement between the Assembly and faith communities?
Thank you very much, Dr. Prodromou. Is the sound good? Can you hear us? There is a lot of noise with the air conditioning. I hope this does not impede us from listening to each other. Thank you very much for this first question, because for me it's very important to explain to you that in our Council of Europe, not only we don't see this contradiction, if you want, between religion and secular ideology, although we are based in France, where secularism is very important. In the Council of Europe, we have been reinforcing intercultural and interreligious dialogue for many, many years. Since 2008, we had annual exchanges on this topic, and participants included representatives of religious communities. Particular topics run, just to give you some example, among teaching religious and convictional facts, media, beliefs and religions, freedom of religion in today's world, challenges and guarantees, or again, building inclusive societies together, the role and place of religion in public space. These were annual exchanges, and His Eminence Emmanuel has, for instance, participated at the time he was in France. The primary objectives of these exchanges was precisely to promote and strengthen the fundamental Council of Europe values in order to foster mutual respect and awareness, tolerance, and mutual understanding within European society. And religious leaders are represented together with non-religious convictions and other planes in society. Now, in 2022, so very recently, we upgraded these annual exchanges by organizing a conference on interreligious dialogue on religion and peace, religion and human rights, under the leadership of the Italian presidency of the Committee of Ministers. This was a conference that brought together Orthodox, Protestants, Catholics, Jewish and Muslim communities, and it led to the adoption of the Strasbourg Principles for Interreligious Dialogue. I think it's interesting for me to quote in brief these principles. They include the recognition of the role of religion in people's life as component of their identities as believers and as citizens, encouraging enhanced knowledge of other people's religion and culture as a decisive aspect of a modern and open European society respectful of diversity, freedom of religion or belief as one of the cornerstones of human rights, and the recognition of religious radicalism and extremism as contrary to a right understanding and practice of them. Allow me here to remind the words of His Holiness, our Patriarch Bartholomew, who said, "A war against religion, a war in the name of religion is a war against religion." So these principles were adopted only 1.5 years ago, and we continue in our assembly the exchanges between religious leaders. Thus, not only we had the honor of His Holiness addressing our assembly in 2007, and His Holiness Pope Francis addressing our assembly in 2014, we also brought together leading religious figures across Europe. In 2011, for instance, we had the Patriarch Daniel of Romania, the President of the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, Cardinal Jean-Louis Thoron, the Chairperson of the Presidency of Religious Affairs of Turkey, Professor Mehmet Görmez, the Chief Rabbi of Russia, Baral Lazar. At that time, Russia was still a member of the Council of Europe, and the plenipotentiary representative of the Council of the Evangelic Church in Germany, and the EU relate Bernard Heffelmer. So you see how we are trying to bring this issue up with one main message in our head: religion should unite and should not divide.
Can I push you a little bit more then on this? You've outlined a set of meetings and dialogues and discussions, and you mentioned the issue in your speech. You mentioned the issue of migration and the fact that Europe, due to demographic and migratory changes, is becoming an ever more religiously plural space. So I wonder, at the level of action, beyond the dialogue, beyond the discussions, what does PACE do to encourage actual practical programming and facilitate engagement between faith communities and other, for example, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, in the face of the increasing religious diversification of Europe? Are there practical efforts that are made to increase that engagement?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Prodromou. Well, I mentioned already all the different forms we are using to bring together religious leaders. And every time there are these gatherings, we have civil society, non-religious communities, always together. So when it comes to civil society, we have also very active participation of NGOs in the Council of Europe. There is the INGO conference, so non-intergovernmental organizations which acquire a status as observers to the Council of Europe. The Parliamentary Assembly not only works with them and gives them a platform to speak, but also uses information whenever we have fact-finding visits, write reports. We use information coming from civil society. Now, on the migration, we have been on the front line from the beginning. We had visits in Greek islands, in Lesbos. We had been visiting Calais. We have been visiting Lampedusa. All these visits are always organized with national authorities, but also with civil society. And in the program of our meetings, we always include meetings with representatives of religious communities. Let me recall the first years when I had the honor to work on the accession of Ukraine into the Council of Europe. It was 94, 95. We had visited Kiev and Crimea and Odessa. And in all these places, the authorities were very keen in bringing us to see the monasteries, to meet with the religious communities, including Greek community. There was, I don't know how things are today, but there was a very vivid community, for instance, in Sebastopol, in Odessa. And in all these meetings, we could feel very strong the importance of the cultural identity and how can this bring people together. And in all our reports, if you go through the reports, we have prepared for enlarging the Council of Europe to accept countries that came out of the Soviet Union juke. We have a chapter on religious freedom, religious rights, and meetings with our religious representatives.
Well, can I take you in a slightly different direction? You've dedicated your life as a human rights attorney, as a lawyer, to the protection of human rights. And we know that in conflict zones, but also in places without conflict, that one of the most important measures of the robustness of human rights protection is the condition of women and girls. And we know that in conflict zones in particular, women and girls suffer disproportionately under violations of human rights and religious freedom in particular. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your own journey as a leader, a human rights lawyer, as a woman in the Parliamentary Assembly, and what the Assembly is doing to focus on the plight of women and girls in the face of human rights abuses. And we read about these in the press, for example, cases like Afghanistan and Nigeria, but this is a worldwide problem. When we think about issues like modern slavery and the indentured servitude of women, the trafficking of women and girls, the sexual exploitation of women and girls, these human rights violations disproportionately affect women. So can you tell us a little bit about PACE and its work, and also from your perspective, whether or not the voices of women as part of the Parliamentary Assembly are more robust and their impact is greater?
Thank you for this question, Dr. Prodromou. Before maybe I speak about my personal journey, let me stress that our Assembly focuses more and more in the recent years on women and girls' rights, and we have produced several reports about violence against women and girls as a weapon in the recent wars. This is, I think, the most tragic reality. Rape and violence and harassment against women is used systematically as a weapon. And when we speak about reparation, you can compensate somebody who loses a house. How can you compensate a girl? How can you compensate a mother who was raped in front of her children? How can you compensate a boy or a husband who either saw this or knew that by leaving to the war, this can happen to his wife and his daughters? So this is something we are putting more and more focus on. I would be happy if there is a way to distribute to you all these reports and resolutions, because I could speak for hours, but this has come to the center of our attention, and maybe I can link it to my personal story if you want, because there are no coincidences. I think leadership can also change things when it comes to the attention that is being put. I was elected as the first woman Secretary General in this 75-year-old now organization 3 years ago, and at that time, the issues on women, gender balance, or violence against women, I have to say, were debated at moments where there were less likely chances that there are many participants in the room. They were the Friday morning debates, as we call them. We made an effort together with the presidents and the political group leaders, who are all men, so it can never be the effort of a woman. We need men to do this, strike this fight together. And now these issues have come in the center of the agenda. So they are debated on the Tuesdays and the Wednesdays where more people are likely to be there. We have lived, at the beginning of my career as Secretary General, the drama of Turkey leaving the Istanbul Convention. We still call it Istanbul Convention because it was open for signature in Istanbul. It's the convention that protects women and girls against violence, but also men and boys. It's about domestic violence, and there are so many wrong stories and wrong perceptions about this convention that led the country where this convention was opened for signature to withdraw. And this happened in 2021. I remember just after we issued a statement calling Turkey to, especially the Turkish parliament, to come back to this decision. Joe Biden made a statement as well. It was, I think, the first time that the American leadership reacted on something that concerned our small Europe, our small Council of Europe, if you see it from the United States perspective. So not only these issues are on the agenda, but I also took the initiative just 2 weeks after the war started in Russia. We convened an extraordinary session of our assembly to decide whether or not Russian Federation should still become member, should still be part of our organization. We brought together women Ukrainian MPs. They were the only ones who could travel. This was March 2022, just 2.5 weeks after the war started. It took them 48 hours to reach Strasbourg. They were exhausted, they were desperate, but they were smiling. And we were impressed by their resilience. And we united around them, and we created the first Women at Pace group. At that time, women parliamentarians were a little bit more than 1/3. And we tried to bring together our voices so that we look at issues from a women perspective. And at that time, you can imagine how important it was for these Ukrainian MPs to speak up, to tell us what was going on. Only a few hours later, our assembly unanimously decided to expel the Russian Federation from the Council of Europe. A sad reality. I had worked for Russian succession as I had worked for Ukrainian succession, but it was an inevitable step to take. You cannot pretend being the leading human rights organization in the continent with ambition to be heard all over the world if you live in the organization, a country which has bluntly invaded and violated every sense of human right we defend in our statutes. In the last 2 years, through changes in the rules, the participation of women parliamentarians has risen up to almost 50-50. We are now 46% women parliamentarians, and we have also established the first rules about sexual harassment of parliamentarians and of staff within our premises. Unfortunately, these things happen, and we need to speak up. I think this is a collective responsibility. And as I mentioned, it's an effort we can only do, women and men together. That's why we have also specific reports on the role of men and boys in stopping violence and speaking up against this phenomenon.
Well, this is cause for hope, then, some of the things that you've described. And I want to ask you if there is cause for hope on something that's come up both in your speech today and on the remarks that we heard yesterday, and that is regarding the issue of cultural heritage protections. Because you mentioned the destruction, the deliberate targeting of cultural and religious heritage sites in times of war, but we also know that in times absent war, that heritage sites and all of the intangible practices that go along with them affect the robustness of democracy, and they affect the survival and sustainability of vulnerable communities and the inclusivity of societies. So I wondered if you could tell us if there is any cause for hope regarding one of the emblematic personalities when it comes to cultural heritage protections, the case of Osman Kavala, who has been suffering a multi-year imprisonment. He is somebody who has dedicated his life to intercultural and interreligious dialogue, and not only dialogue, but action, cooperation, and action. I wonder if there are things that are happening regarding heritage protections in his case, and also with the approaching 50-year timeline of the division of Cyprus, where heritage destruction in the northern part of the island has been so extensive. These are just examples of what we see worldwide. As you said, Russia deliberately targeting heritage sites in Ukraine. We see this all over the African continent. We see the destruction of heritage now being defined as a war crime. Are there areas for hope, perhaps around Kavala, but more generally, when it comes to the protection not only of intangible sites, but for all the living people who are part of the community that do those practices at the sites, whether it's chanting and music, whether it's handcrafts, whether it's the passing on of language. Can you tell us about the work of PACE in that regard?
Thank you, Dr. Prodromou. You raise questions that could take us the whole week to discuss. It's a very big challenge to answer you briefly, but let me stick to this message of hope that I think our Ecumenical Patriarch, His Holiness Bartholomew, also gave us yesterday in his opening speech. First of all, you mentioned the name of Osman Kavala. This is, again, very close to my heart. It's a case of somebody who was convicted, imprisoned 7 years ago, and the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg The Human Rights Court is part of our Council of Europe, where every citizen from all over the world, as long as he or she lives in a member state, can address. So, of course, Osman Kavala, a very well-known philanthropist, addressed himself to the court, and the court twice found that his detention is a violation of the European Convention of Human Rights and asked the Turkish authorities to release him. Now, I say that I have some good news today because we had visited Osman Kavala, the rapporteurs from the Assembly, October 2023. We will visit him again on 10th of June. So in the next 10 days, I signed the letter asking for this, and it was granted by the Turkish authorities. So it's already very important that we have the cooperation of the parliamentary delegation of Turkey to our Assembly. And the good news comes because we hear now statements, especially under the leadership of the Turkish chair of delegation, that seem to indicate that there are now genuine discussions within Turkey for the release of Osman Kavala. Now, how this will happen, if finally it will happen, it's difficult for me to say, but it is very important to stress the constructive dialogue that is ongoing and where our Assembly, today led also by a Greek, Theodoros Rousopoulos, has been elected the President of the Assembly in January. He undertook this dialogue with the Turkish parliamentarians, and we think the solution may come out in the next months because indeed Osman Kavala is a leading figure worldwide. And it's important to inform you that in October 2023, our Assembly honored Osman Kavala with our Václav Havel Human Rights Prize. His wife, Aisha, came to receive the prize while her husband was in detention, and he dedicated to all those who are imprisoned for praising the fundamental values and freedoms. And it was, I have to say, a very strong moment. Now, you mentioned many things in your question. If I can react to some of them, you mentioned what we are doing in other areas of cultural heritage issues. Let me also mention the word on Cyprus. We are celebrating the 50th anniversary of Cyprus invasion. We have been, of course, joining our voices to the United Nations voices in calling for a peaceful solution of the Cyprus conflict for so many years. But concretely, what happens in Strasbourg that is maybe different to what happens in other fora is that through the European Court of Human Rights, numerous cases of Cypriot citizens or association foundations have managed to get justice, and there is a property committee that is working now in Turkey that compensates those who have suffered from damage. In the next days, I will be traveling straight from here later today in Oslo. We have a meeting where we will be adopting a report on Famagusta and especially Varosha. Varosha, you may know, is a ghost city since the invasion as part of the Varosha. And we managed to create a first contact between the two communities at local level. So only a few weeks ago, mayors from the Republic of Cyprus and the Greek part of this community met with Turkish Cypriot representatives at local level. And apparently there are concrete projects now that move on between the two communities, and we hope that when we will adopt this text, we will adopt it at committee level in Oslo and then in the Assembly in June, we will manage to give a message to call also the leadership at highest level to follow these examples, hoping for a united Ireland sooner than later.
Thank you for sharing real-time developments. We appreciate that. Thank you. I have, since we're here and all concerned with the Ecumenical Patriarchate as part of the broader concern with human rights and religious freedom. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work of the Council of Europe with the Patriarchate and, for example, the reports of the Venice Commission on the legal personality and the ecumenicity of the Patriarchate? This is an opportunity for us to learn in granular fashion from you about the work that's being done.
Thank you, Dr. Prodromou. Well, it was a very emotional moment where our ecumenical Patriarch, His Holiness came to Strasbourg in 2007, in January 2007, to address our assembly and deliver a message of peace and call for interreligious dialogue. On this occasion, we continued some discussions how we could be of help. I had the honor, together with my husband, to also meet His Holiness in Constantinople. And what started from some ideas became more concrete when we visited him in 2008 with a monitoring committee. It was a Ukrainian chair then, Serhiy Holovati, today is judge at the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. And we put two concrete questions to the Venice Commission. The Venice Commission is a body of constitutional experts open not only to Council of Europe member states, but the whole world. So you have United States, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa participating in the Venice Commission as well. The question was, is the Patriarch entitled to be called ecumenical? Because there was this doubt. The Turkish authorities would call him simply the Greek Orthodox Patriarch. So is he entitled to this ecumenical character? And maybe equally important, what about legal personality? The Patriarchate is deprived of legal personality, and this gives rise to a number of problems regarding especially property rights. So the Venice Commission in 2010 adopted an opinion where, without any doubt, said that the freedom of religion, as enshrined in Article 9 of the European Convention of Human Rights, I mentioned earlier, together with the freedom of association, protected by Article 11 of our Convention, make it absolutely clear that associations, foundations have the right of legal personality. And there was no reason why the Patriarchy should be deprived of this right, and in general, non-Muslim religious communities in Turkey should be protected. The opinion had then welcomed efforts to reform the law on foundations, the legislation in Turkey, and expressed the hope that as these reforms evolve, the legal personality would be recognized. When it comes to his title, the opinion said that it is, of course, a right that we cannot deny from the leadership of the Ecumenical Patriarchate without, at the same time, obliging the Turkish authorities to call him in a certain way. But the Venice Commission said again, we see no reason why not. So I think this was our small, concrete contribution. It is my very big pleasure and honor to announce that we have now addressed an invitation to His Holiness to address our Assembly in January 2025. I hope very much to have him back. January is important for our little Greek Orthodox Church in Strasbourg because we are the three hierarchs, les trois hiérarches, and we celebrate end of January, the same time as the sessions of our assembly. So in the presence of His Eminence, our Metropole of France, I'm saying it, we hope to have our Patriarch, and I count very much on His Holiness and Pidophoros to bring his message to him.
Well, continuing, I guess, on a positive note, can you tell us, in your work with the Assembly, what's an example of a win? Something that the Assembly has made a decision on, or a program stream that it's been working on that has to do with human rights and religious freedom, and where you've seen a real change on the ground? and then maybe an area where there's been less change than hoped for. But let's start with a win, with a positive. Is there an example that comes to mind?
The very first win is the European Convention of Human Rights itself. It was our Parliamentary Assembly at its first meeting in 1950, which asked for a convention protecting human rights. And then the issue was, would we create also a system whereby we can make the states responsible and accountable, or it will be a declaration, as is the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights that His Holiness referred to yesterday. And the bet was very difficult, and it was taken back then for an accountability system together with the European Court of Human Rights. We gave the member states the possibility to opt, so initially it was optional, but with years going by, especially when the Soviet Union collapsed, so after the fall of the Berlin Wall, to allow for the accession of all these countries coming from Central and Eastern Europe to join the Council of Europe, it became binding that they would be subjected to the protection of human rights in the court. It was before the European Commission on the court, now it's a single court of human rights. So definitely, this is, I think, by far our achievement, but also a series of conventions that help us in daily life. We don't even know it, but these were proposals coming from the Parliamentary Assembly. So I would mention the Framework Convention on National Minorities. This is also a convention that covers religious minorities. I mentioned the violence against the women and girls and domestic violence Istanbul Convention. This was also a proposal of our convention where we see concrete changes in legislation in the member states. Well, I mentioned the European Convention. Through the European Court that we elect, the Assembly elects the judges, and we supervise the execution of its judgments together with the Committee of Ministers, who has the primary responsibility. So these are achievements that affect the life of citizens on a daily basis. More recently, we fought for two things where I think we can also be proud as a win situation. One is artificial intelligence. So we asked for a convention on artificial intelligence covering the human rights, democracy, and rule of law issues. And this was adopted only a few weeks ago. The first international instrument on artificial intelligence, negotiated with the United States of America and many other countries, Japan, Israel, all over the world, not simply the Council of Europe, and the European Union was present at the negotiations, but it is a Council of Europe convention, puts in its focus human rights, rule of law, and democracy. How can you combine artificial intelligence and its benefits and not surrender any democratic safeguards to robots? Let's put it this way. And this was also something coming up from our Assembly. And the second one, again, I think very close to the heart of His Holiness, our Ecumenical Patriarch, environment. We have been pushing for a legal instrument on protecting environment as a human right, a safe, healthy environment as a human right. For the moment, it is protected through the case law of the court, but is not as such guaranteed by any protocol in our convention. So I hope His Holiness, while he'll address the Assembly, he will encourage this progress, as he's so well known as a Green Patriarch.
I think, Archon, we have questions, right? Okay, we're collecting questions. I think Archon Sideris is collecting them on the white paper. So if you need paper, please let him know. While we're collecting questions, I wondered if I could follow up just with one last one, and then I'll begin reading these. You mentioned AI, artificial intelligence, and this is something that came up yesterday. I wondered, in terms of developing that convention on AI, is there engagement in terms of the Assembly with faith communities? Because if we look at the discussions in faith communities about artificial intelligence, they go directly to the question of what it means to be human. And so I wonder if indeed members of the Assembly or committees in the Assembly are engaging directly with religious communities about this fundamental question of what does it mean to be human, and what are the implications of the development and the use of artificial intelligence when it comes to how we understand what is human and what is humanity.
Thank you for this question, because this is exactly what I think was our success, that we put the human in the center of this new convention. Now, in negotiating, yes, associations also of religious communities were present. There was a very wide scope of representatives that this instrument has been negotiating for more than 2 years, 2 years and a half. And contrary to what you would expect from a convention that would have had in its mind mainly economic interest, business interest, you can understand we had the American companies also present in negotiation, Google, Apple, Amazon, Meta. They were, of course, arguing for a very liberal convention that would allow almost everything. The challenge was to put the human in the center, and this is recognized in the first articles of this convention. Human dignity is the absolute principle that has to be safeguarded by states which sign and ratify this convention. Now, it covers, it binds public institutions. It is more difficult to make it binding on private enterprises. And because this discussion was very problematic, as you can imagine, the compromise was that member states will decide whether to extend it to private companies or not. But if a private company works on behalf of a public authority, if a public work is entrusted to a private actor, then the private actor is obliged to respect the rights enshrined in the convention, with human dignity being at its very center. But I think this is a very new development. We will start collecting ratifications as of September. The more states are ready to ratify, extend it to private sector, the more efficient the system is. And I hope that we can count also on religious communities in this path.
I think for everyone in this room, there's probably a concern around this, because I think we're all much more accustomed to thinking about the potential violations of human rights that go with the abuse and the malign use of digital technologies for state surveillance, for violence by non-state actors, those kinds of violations of human rights. But if we can't even agree on what it means to be human, then protecting human rights in an age of a postmodern age of artificial intelligence will raise enormous questions for human rights protections. Well, thank you, George. So let me read some of the questions here, and I hope you will oblige us. Okay, here's a question, and this gets to enforcement, compliance and enforcement. To what extent have the reports and resolutions of your Assembly been received and implemented by the member states? So implementation, and in the absence of implementation, does the Assembly have any compliance and enforcement mechanisms?
Thank you for this question. This question points at the heart, I would say, of international law. I was the student of Antonio Cassese, a very big mind in a very small person. I remember a very humble person, a very big mind of international law. And enforcement is always the weak point of international law, and we are an international organization. But let me tell you what are the mechanisms and how we actually see compliance in practice. First of all, the Council of Europe started with 10 member states. Back in 1949, 75 years ago, it was a club of democracy. It was relatively easy among Benelux, France, and the UK to agree on what democracy is. You can imagine that with the years, and when we wanted to open our arms to the countries coming up out of the Soviet Union and give them a platform for dialogue, for meeting their European partners, we had either to lower our standards or to create mechanisms whereby we would accompany these new countries. We opted for the latter, so we had quick accessions of countries such as Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, later on Azerbaijan, but even before Czech Republic, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, etc. The more you widen your family, the more difficult it becomes to implement your decisions. I'm afraid the United Nations is in a way a quite sad illustration of that. But in our case, because we have the European Court of Human Rights, and because we work hand by hand with the court, the Assembly and the court work together, not only because, as I said, we elect the judges, but because we give a public space in talking about non-compliance of non-compliance of judgments. So the Parliamentary Assembly has a standing general rapporteur on this issue, and even a committee on execution of judgments. The rapporteur happens to be Kostis Evstathiou, a Cypriot a member for the last years, and every time there is a non-compliance of a judgment, this is brought up in a public debate in the Assembly. And I can assure you that public exposure of countries is equally important than a legal enforcement mechanism, which can take years. I was referring yesterday to a tragic accident my family went through. 17 years ago, we are still in front of civil courts for a simple, clear accident, 17 years. So I don't believe that legal reinforcement is always the only or the best solution. Political pressure can be equally important. So you mentioned earlier the Kavala case. This is one of the most difficult ones. And here again, I think it's the political dialogue that will lead to hopefully release. We had examples with a political prisoner in Azerbaijan, Mammadov, again detained simply for his beliefs and convictions. He was released after pressure by our assembly. We have also a constant monitoring. It is in the framework of this monitoring that Turkey was visited, and our patriarch was also met at that time, and this led to the opinion of the Venice Commission. And this mechanism is open to all member states, but in particular to newer, if I may say so, democracies.
Well, I have, okay, on a related note, on a compliance note, here is a question. It says, a key issue in human rights and minority rights is the issue of remedy and reparations, particularly regarding minorities that are vulnerable and in danger of disappearance because of past violations. How is it that in the case of non-compliance beyond dialogue, are there specific mechanisms for member states who are non-compliant and that refuse either to meet the judgments of the court and or, in the case of ongoing dialogue, refuse to comply with the findings of the court? Are there other remedies?
Yes. Oh, yes, of course. So when there is a violation, a constant and systemic violation, we get into what we call infringement procedures. Right. The infringement procedures means that the case goes back to the Committee of Ministers, and from the Committee of Ministers back to the court, and the court has to, again, publicly denounce the violation. Normally, from that moment, there is a roadmap that is established with the authorities for compliance, either through the infringement procedures or through a political mechanism that is created by our assembly, and it's called joint complementary procedure, complementary exactly to related mechanisms. The idea is that if a state does not comply, this will lead to suspension and eventually expulsion. Let me say that our Greek president, Theodoros Rousopoulos, often starts by saying I'm proud of being Greek because my country is the first one that was expelled from the Council of Europe. And this was the case when the Greek colonials took power and suppressed what we have most precious in this country, democracy. The Council of Europe, and it was the Parliamentary Assembly which started political proceedings that led eventually to a decision for suspension of Greece. Just before the suspension decision was taken by the Committee of Ministers, the Greek junta withdrew. But it was only at the end of these proceedings, just before the decision was voted, they preferred to say we left. Now, I mentioned the example of the Russian Federation. Again, a concrete, much more recent example where a country was shown the exit road because precisely violated human rights in a neighboring state. Now, if you give me a more concrete example, I can be also more concrete, but I cannot think of a single case that has not led either to reparation or to a procedure on reparation. I mentioned the Cypriot cases, for instance, where we have a continuous process going on through friendly settlements going through this reparation procedure. Of course, what ultimately we want is to see the return of the places in Varosha, in Famagusta, to the lawful inhabitants, and this will be part of the report I just mentioned to you to be debated in June.
Thank you. And the question that I just read actually came from the Ecumenical Federation of Constantinopolitans. So just to complete the question. I'm going to turn now to something that takes us, a question that takes us back to the issue of heritage, cultural and religious heritage, tangible and intangible. It says here, in the framework of Russia's war on Ukraine, 630 places of worship and community buildings were destroyed, and the Cathedral of Odessa was heavily damaged. What is the Council of Europe doing, or will it do, on this issue, and for the urgently needed repairing work of the Cathedral of Odessa? And I would ask to expand this question to your mention of the destruction and or illicit trafficking of Armenian Kashgars with Azerbaijan's destruction of heritage sites in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Thank you for this question. I think I actually mentioned it. I think I mentioned it already in my speech. It is a Ukrainian parliamentarian, Evgenia Kravchuk, who works precisely on this issue of cultural erasure and destruction. And I mentioned in particular the case of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and also of the religious sites in Crimea. So the Council of Europe looks at it very carefully. And let me add that we have also established the first registry of damage. And it has been already opened and signed by some 50 member states. This means that every damage that has been, every individual community that has suffered of damage will be registered. We have more than 150,000 claims, and a reparation mechanism will be put into force. So hopefully we will be actually more effective in repairing damage of religious sites in Ukraine that we may be in other parts of the world, whether it is Armenia or Cyprus or Greece. Because there is this increased attention, funds have been released to create a compensation mechanism, and we actually in the Assembly promote the idea of seizing Russian assets, confiscating Russian assets all over the world, and using the money collected from this confiscation to compensate the damage that has been provoked, caused to either individuals or sites. Again, I could send you with big pleasure the exact report as soon as it is adopted in June. and you can follow the details of how this works.
And of course, that discussion about seizing Russian assets is a highly controversial one because it would set a precedent, and certainly then, in terms of the Assembly, it would raise the question of consistency and application of seizure of assets for states that have destroyed cultural heritage.
Well, our Assembly has been very much on the front line when it comes to the war of Ukraine. So for us, it was a unanimous decision to use Russian assets confiscation. This woke up, if you want, earlier discussion about reparations. Some Polish representatives of the former government, the peace government, have approached also Greek parliamentarians to say, why don't we ask for reparation from the Germans for damage caused during First and Second World War? I have to say, politically, this is not the way Greece wants to go ahead. And with the change of government in Poland, I think we will not be outspoken on this. But in the case of Ukraine, we are very loudly advocating for the reparation mechanism and even for an ad hoc tribunal to judge the crime of aggression, which is again something that does not exist in international law, but we want to create.
Do we have time? We have time for a couple more questions. I'm going to read these simultaneously and then, or sequentially, and then.
I would like to leave at the end, if possible, a few minutes to talk to you about the roots of cultural roots program of our Council of Europe as part of our intercultural dialogue to end up with, again, a positive and concrete note. But I'm happy to answer more questions. You handle the time. I have no idea what time.
Okay, all right. I'll ask these quickly and then we can close with that. One is a question about how can governments work with religious organizations in conflict resolution without giving the impression of, capturing or usurping these religious bodies. And the reference here is to the Kremlin's instrumentalization of the Russian Orthodox Church. How can the Council of Europe work actively with faith communities without being seen as trying to co-opt them or to instrumentalize religion?
Well, I think the problems with the Moscow Patriarchate is no secret to anyone. So I mentioned to you that already in 94, 95, when Ukraine became a member state, the issue of religion was already at the table. We could already then hear the people who were coming to us. I was accompanying then first what we call eminent lawyers for a legal report, and then the political report. We had a Hungarian parliamentarian and a French Jean-Pierre Massenet, who wrote the report, and the people would come to us and tell us, we want to exercise our religious freedom, but we don't want to be part of the Moscow control and dominance. Can you help us? And this is how I said this was part of our work. Now, from the moment our patriarch gave autocephaly to Ukrainian church, I think there is no risk of misusing or misinterpreting our context, because our contacts are taken with the Greek the Autocephalous Church of Ukraine. It's not, of course, with Moscow Patriarch, which I'm afraid, it was said yesterday, it is shocking for a holy man to encourage war. We would have hoped to see religious leaders, and I know there were some initiatives for our Patriarch to work on that, but how can you do it when you have in Russia somebody who encourages, who gives his benediction to the war? So I don't think there is any risk of manipulation or misinterpretation. We know with whom we are talking. We know who is talking to us. And the propaganda that is going on in Moscow, I'm afraid, of course, we cannot stop. I'm just very sad for the Russian people. Because if you allow me to say that, I think Russian people and Russian culture deserve more than what we see now with their leadership. Our assembly called the Russian regime regime, terrorist. We spoke about a terrorist-sponsored state. These are very hard qualifications, but in every occasion we try to make the difference with the Russian people and the Russian culture. And I hope religion could one day be a vehicle to get these Russian people back to the path of human rights and democracy.
Well, and thank you for reminding us that the actions of a state should not be equated with the actions of the people, so that people are not demonized and essentialized.
Absolutely.
The last question, very quickly, is about the issue of the Roma. And does the Council of Europe engage on the issue of treatment of Roma as a minority? Are they considered a minority? What kind of minority? And how does the Council of Europe engage on that issue?
Well, there is a lot of work that is going on in the Council of Europe about the Roma. There is a special representative of the Roma community. We meet the Roma people again whenever we had to deal with a new member state. Myself, I had to work on all these files, Moldova, Ukraine, Czech Republic, Slovakia. We were meeting with the representatives of Roma. They are very present in our work. And on the 2nd of August, we are invited together with the President of the Assembly to Auschwitz to commemorate the killings of Roma by the Nazis. I'm told that it's a very strong ceremony. We anyway commemorate the Holocaust every January, but precisely beginning of August is the day for the Roma. And there are, of course, again, many cases in the European Court of Human Rights from either individuals or associations that bring up their cases.